Hi there, I've owned Serato Sample for quite some time now, but just recently I've been getting into using samples. I bought a massive Yurt Rock sample library, and I bought quite a lot of electronic sounds sample libraries. So I've been getting into this world of samples, chopping up samples, using them on my Dirty Wave M8, and here I'm using Serato Sample within Reason. Serato Sample is not a sampler, it's a sample player and editor, and it works as a MIDI instrument inside a DAW. It doesn't officially support Reason, but it does work within that program, so that's what I'm going to use today. If I press play here in Reason, you'll hear I've got two loops working. And the one you can see on the screen here is a drum loop. I'll just play it within Serato Sample. It's a 2-bar pattern. I've deliberately picked a loop that runs at 120 beats per minute. Here it is up here. It's called Moab 120 BPM. And if I go to the other sample I'm using, this is a guitar loop. 83 Ballad 120E, this one is again running at 120, and the sequencer in Reason is set at 120, so everything is set evenly at the moment. Now, one very useful thing is to use the computer keyboard if you haven't got a MIDI keyboard handy and you want to trigger slices or notes. So I've got the computer keyboard down here. You'll see this is a slice that I've set here, okay, and I've got the playback set to trigger. That means if I press A on my computer keyboard, it'll play the whole of the sample. Whereas if I have this clicked here, the hold version of playback, as soon as I let go, it stops, so I have to hold it down to play as much of the sample that I want. By the way, up here you'll see this V, which is for velocity. If this is ticked, then your computer keyboard, it triggers the sample, but you don't hear anything, so you have to turn the velocity off and then you can hear the sample. It's a bit of a funny old quirk that. I suppose it's because the computer keyboard doesn't have any velocity sensitivity. With some DAWs, these pads representing these three slices that I've got here, they come up with the letters that you're pressing on your keyboard. It doesn't work that way in Reason, so you have to rename pad, and if I double click this and put A and then press return, now I know that's, if I press A it's going to trigger that. This one here is W, so right click this, rename pad, put in a W, press return, and this one here S. And that's done. So I know that A is the first slice, W is the second slice, and S is the third slice. I'm not going to go into all the ins and outs of Serato Sample here today because it's been done elsewhere and probably better on the internet, but just suffice to say I'm going to pick out a few things that I struggled with and you may be struggling with as well. So with this computer keyboard, the A key is C1, the W key is C sharp, the S key is D, and so on and so forth. And if you want to change the octave of the computer keyboard, if you look down here, it says press Z to go down and X to come up. So I've got three slices in this drum loop set up on the A, W and S keys of my computer keyboard, and they represent C, C sharp and D on a piano keyboard, and I could of course plug a MIDI keyboard in to do that. Now supposing I go to this W slice here, click on that, notice I've got the playback set on hold, so it's only playing and stopping. Now supposing I change the filter on this, supposing I make this really dull by bringing the filter down on this. Now if I play the A slice, as it comes to where that W slice is, you notice you don't hear that change in the parameter. You only get it if you actually play that slice, and of course the rest of that slice will sound like that. If I press A, It goes through where that W slice is but doesn't play that slice like that, so that's worth remembering. The freeze function is pretty useful. If you hover over this sample area, you get the zoom controls come up, and you get the grid and you get the freeze. Now this snowflake is the freeze command. So if I click it and the snowflake goes dark like this, so you can go to any slice without the actual sample playing or the slice playing, which is pretty useful. And you can go, if I press play here, goes from there, I go to here, press play. So freeze is pretty useful for messing around with the sample when you don't want to keep re-triggering, keep playing. That can be a nuisance sometimes. If I click the A pad for this slice and I click the favourite star, now if I go to trash, you see the trash is grey. I can't trash this slice. Whereas if I go to W, I could trash that slice. So the favourite function is a way of locking a slice so you don't lose it. If I were to alter one of these parameters, supposing I brought the level up on this actual slice, if I didn't like that, I hold shift and click that parameter, that level parameter, and it goes back to its default of 0 dB. Right, now this is the big one. This is grid edit, and this drove me nuts. I had literally a few sleepless nights over this. So let's just get our drum loop up. Here we are, press play. Okay, now for any of the magic to work on this, you need this icon lit. This is the pitch and time. Without this on, you can't do any time stretching or shrinking, and you want the sync button on as well. So you'll still get pitch and time without sync, but without pitch and time on, you won't get sync. So my advice is to have both those on so that it's working with the DAW. Obviously this is ultimately pretty useless unless you get it working in tandem with your DAW. In this case it's Reason. So if you hover over this main sample area here and click the grid icon here, okay, there's nothing in it because I haven't made a grid yet. So how do I do that? Well, I'm going to go to the beginning of the sample by clicking this top triangle there, getting back to my first slice, and you can see this white mark here. This is the playhead. So if I move that up here, you can see it moving in the main. So I want it right at the beginning here, okay, and I'm going to go back to grid here. So I've got all these controls here, and if I click that grid off, then it goes back to the parameter view where you can change the parameters of the slices. So click grid again and we've got the grid view. So I'm going to press set grid start, and you can see number one, that's bar number one. If I come up here to the zoom control and if I zoom out, so at the beginning you'll see you've got bars before and bars afterwards. So this is bar number one, beat 2, beat 3, beat 4 of bar number 1, then bar number 2, beat 2, beat 3, and so forth. Okay, and if we just scroll across, you'll see that bar number 2 is on this slice here, bar number 3 is here at the end, because there's only 2 bars in this sample. Okay, so that's setting up the grid. So these are time markers, bars and beats. So that's pretty straightforward. So I've set the grid start on that first downbeat of bar 1. You can change the BPM for the entire sample by clicking and dragging on the beat markers. You can move the playhead just by putting your index finger on the trackpad if you've got one and just dragging backwards and forwards. If you want to change the overall timing, best thing is, I find, is to click on one of these time markers and then drag the time markers in and out. Now notice as you make the markers further apart, the speed of the sample increases. If I've got them really wide here, listen to the speed now if I just press the play button here. Really fast, and if I drag them closer together, it slows everything down. Let's just reset this BPM of the sample to 120. Now this is the confusing thing, as you'll see in a moment. If I move this BPM up and down, just click on it and drag up and down, watch the time markers. I let go, you'll see they'll snap to whatever I've done there, like that. Or I can use the triangles and you can see the beat markers, time markers moving in real time. Again, let's reset it to 120. This will all become clear in a while. So notice how as you make the markers further apart, the perceived speed, the actual speed of the sample increases, but the sample BPM decreases. Now the reason for all this is because if you move the markers further apart, you're making Serato play the sample over less bars, so it has to take longer to do so. And if you move the markers closer together, Serato is taking more bars to play the sample, so it moves slower. Now that doesn't make a lot of sense, I know, but I will explain it better in a while. Now, let's put another time marker in here. Let's put one here at bar number 2. So bar number 2 here, let's line it up and we'll press set. So we've got a time marker at bar 1 and at bar 2. Now if I come in between bars 1 and 2 and if I drag these time markers, notice how the ones in between 1 and 2 are getting closer together. These ones outside beyond bar 2 are staying at the same distance. So let's have a listen to how that actually sounds, what that actually does. So dragging those closer together, let's do that again. Slower, faster. So you can get different speeds between the two bars. You probably wouldn't want to do anything as extreme as that, but you could kind of slightly adjust the timing of one bar against another, just in case it was a little bit off, because sometimes loops are not recorded perfectly and sometimes you do need to make slight adjustments. And there's a whole load of stuff about this on the internet, so I'm not going to go too deeply into that, but it is quite interesting that you can do that. Now we've messed up our overall BPM time. Let's put it back. And then it's back as normal. Now if I bring the playhead somewhere between the beginning of bar 1 and the beginning of bar 2, and if I click the adjust button, notice how it's got the same effect as dragging I had earlier. So now if I go back to the beginning, really slow here, then speeds up there. Let's reset it. It's quite strange this, isn't it? But lots of things you can do. By the way, if you want to hear the metronome, if I put the metronome on, if I press the A key here, you don't hear it. You've got to actually press the play button to hear the metronome, and you can hear that the slice is perfectly in time. If you use the slip function here, this moves the entire grid backwards and forwards, and of course what that does is it changes where bar 1 and bar 2 is, so that could mess everything up, so we'll put that back where it was. See, now my time marker 1 is actually set before the beginning of the samples. That's not what we want, so we'll just put that back. But it slips the entire grid backwards and forwards. So if you've changed the timing between two time markers, that will also move as well. Let's just press save, because we can actually lock that in as it is. That brings up our parameter view again. So I've positioned the playhead quite near where I want the slice to be. I don't know exactly where to put the playhead, and there's a really good way of doing this automatically, putting it where I want it. So somewhere near will do fine. Make sure this Quantize button is illuminated yellow. So the playhead's here. I obviously want this slice to be on this transient here where this burst of volume is. So now if I press this pad down here to create a new slice, and if I move the playhead out of the way, you'll see that slice has gone exactly on this transient. So using this Quantize function is a really good way of setting the slice exactly where I want it. if that quantize is off, then wherever the playhead is, that's where the new slice will be, and that may be what you want. You can create multiple slices in the same place, and what you can do then is, if you had a note in a melodic sample like the other one, the guitar one, you could create a chord at that point. I'm not going to do that here because that's been done elsewhere and explained really well. Let's talk a bit about the old days of sampling. When using an old rudimentary sampler, pitch was always tied to speed. That is to say, if a sample was recorded at a pitch of C4 and you played that note on the keyboard, you'd hear the original recording at the correct pitch and speed, length, etc. If you played notes higher up the keyboard, the pitch would be raised, the speed would increase, and the length of the sample would decrease, giving you that kind of chipmunk effect, which we all found amusing for about 5 minutes. In the same way, if you played notes lower down the keyboard, the pitch would be lowered, the speed would decrease, and the length of the sample would increase, giving you that kind of low, drunken, slurred sound. With the invention of what we used to call elastic audio, pitch stretching and shrinking, all that changed, and now we can record a sample as before, and when we play it higher up the keyboard, the pitch would be the same, but the speed would still be faster and the length shorter. Conversely, if you played lower down the keyboard, the original pitch would still be preserved, but the speed would still be slower and the length longer. So let's go back to this beat grid view, hover over and click grid. We want to try and understand what's happening here, and this is the thing that drove me completely nuts. So if you change the grid, I grab hold of a time marker and just bring the grid in and out. What is actually happening here? Well, if you keep your eyes on the BPM down here, as I do that, you'll see it going down and coming up. So as the time markers get closer together, the BPM of the sample goes up, and then as I drag the time markers further apart, the BPM drops down. Let's just reset it to 120. If I drag the time markers so they're closer together, more and more bars are being placed into the sample area. So this has the effect of slowing things down. Let's take that metronome off, don't want that on. That slows everything down because you're forcing the sample to be played across more bars. If I drag these time markers out, this is going to speed everything up because less bars are being played. Now listen. That's easy to understand. So the big question is, if it's going faster, why is this BPM down here getting lower? My initial question was, well, that's really weird. I would have thought that would be showing at a higher speed because the sample is running faster, and this is what gave me the sleepless nights, and I will attempt to explain it to you now. The sample has a BPM burnt into its data. So in other words, when this drum loop was recorded, it was recorded at 120 beats per minute, and that's kind of burnt into its metadata, if you like. So when you drop it into a Serato Sample, within reason, it immediately defaults to 120 beats per minute. So if, for instance, that BPM is 120 and the sample sees 4 bars instead of 2, due to time stretching, it increases its burnt in BPM to 240 because it thinks it has to double its speed to cover 4 bars in the time it took to play 2. So let's just do that. Let's just drag these slices in. So I'll cheat a bit here and I'll just make this tempo 240. So the BPM of the sample is showing 240, but listen to how slow things are going now. Because you can see that there are now 4 bars being played, okay, whereas before with 120, go back to that, there's only 2 bars, you see. Let's say that again for you. The sample increases its burnt in, what I call the burnt in BPM, to 240 because it thinks it has to double its speed to cover 4 bars in the time it took to play 2. Normally a BPM of 240 would result in the chipmunk effect, but because the sample is being stretched over 4 bars and thus slowed down, this compensates for this and the pitch is forced down and the original is preserved. So it's all to do with this business of maintaining the same pitch. So let's do that in the other direction now. Let's make the burnt in BPM 60. Now if I press play, it's really fast, isn't it? Because it's all being squashed into 1 bar. So if the sample sees 1 bar instead of 2, so remember 2 bars is the default, 120 beats per minute. If it sees 1 bar instead of 2 and the time has been shrunk, it decreases its burnt in BPM to 60 because it thinks it has to halve its speed to play the same sample over 1 bar in the time it took to play 2. Normally a BPM of 60 will result in the slurred, drunken, low-pitched effect, but because the sample is being shrunk to 1 bar and thus sped up, this compensates for this and the pitch is forced up and the original pitch is preserved. There are kind of two forces at work here, the speed versus the time. Remember, speed is relative to pitch, so ordinarily the faster you play back a sample, the higher pitched it sounds. But if you stretch the sample out over more bars than it was originally played over, the pitch is commensurately forced down and no change in pitch is perceived. So conversely, if you play a sample back slowly, the pitch drops, but if you shrink it so it's playing over less bars, the pitch is commensurately forced up, and once again no change in that pitch occurs. So if all that has burnt your brain, and it may well have done, it's certainly burnt my brain, all you've got to remember, the net result of all this is as follows. The faster you play back a sample, less bars, the slower its burnt in BPM will appear. If this is a low number here, then you know it's going to be fast in the playback. And if this is a high number, it's like 240, and you play it, then things are going to slow down dramatically. So let's look at it the other way around. Lower the burnt in BPM, let's put it down to 60. And the timelines have expanded because Serato Sample sees a slower speed here in the BPM, and so reduces the amount of bars to speed the sample up so that the same pitch is preserved. So the result is the sample plays back faster with no pitch change. Or conversely, let's raise that burnt in BPM to 240. Watch the timelines squash together. Timelines will constrict because Serato Sample sees a faster speed here, and so it increases the amount of bars so that the same pitch is preserved, and the result is the sample plays back slower with no pitch change. If you leave the burnt in BPM as it is, 120, that's the default, then obviously everything plays as you would expect because there's no compensation needed to keep the pitch the same. The most important thing to remember here is, let's set this to 240, this BPM here, the sample's BPM, is not the actual BPM. That is set in the DAW if you've got it synced up. We'll talk about the relationship between the DAW and Serato Sample a little bit later on. There's a lot to it, isn't there? Sorry there's so much to talk about here, and I hope I'm not burning your brain here. Now with this sync switched on here in Serato Sample, the DAW's, in this case Reason's, BPM works proportionately to Serato Sample. Let's show you some examples here. So with the sync on, the DAW's BPM doubles the actual tempo if it's twice that of the sample and halves it if it's half. The BPM of the DAW will increase or decrease the overall tempo as dictated by the sample's BPM. If they're both set to the same BPM, any tempo will result in the sample's original tempo being adhered to as one depends on the other. So let's give you a few examples here. So we've got the sample BPM set to 120 and the Reason tempo is set to 120. So if I press play, the sample plays back 120 as you would expect. Now if I set the sample BPM to 60 and leave the Reason's tempo at 120, the actual tempo is 240. See, because the Reason tempo is 120, so it doubles. Show again. Okay. If the sample BPM is set to 60, and if I set Reason's tempo to 240, the resulting actual tempo is actually 480. Listen to this. Ridiculously quick. Let's keep the sample BPM at 60 and we'll set the DAW BPM at 60. There's no actual proportionate change, so it will play back at the normal speed. let's alter the sample BPM to 240, and we'll put the reason tempo to 240. Now it's going to play back at the normal speed here because there's no proportionate change. See? So the two depended upon each other. Now if you turn the sync off here, the door's BPM has no effect on the actual tempo. This will be dependent on the sample's BPM and the amount of bars as before. Okay, so it's best to keep that sync on. Right, so let's do a little bit of sequencing in Reason. Let's look at the sequencer page and the drums, and this C1 note is triggering the whole sample. On the drums and on the guitar, same thing. So let's just go into the Serato Sample again. Go to Rack, let's look at the drums, play it up here. Pay careful attention to this playback mode. This is trigger mode with the dotted arrow, okay? That plays the whole sample. Just press and let go. Otherwise, if you have this on hold and you press the pad, it stops. You've got to keep holding on to it. So put it on trigger. Just so you know, if I was to open up this slice by dragging on this bottom arrow here, now if I press the pad, and I've got it on the dotted arrow on the trigger mode, it'll only play to the end of that slice marker, that bottom one. Okay, so drag that back so the beginning and the end are the same. Now if I press play, press the pad, it plays the whole thing. If you're in grid mode, okay, and you want to alter a slice, you can't drag these markers out. You can only do that if you are in this mode here. Now you can see this is illuminated and I can move the end point. So in this first example, I'm going to set the sample BPM to 120. Let's go back to the grid mode. Can't see that otherwise. It's 120.09. Sometimes these samples come in slightly off. Let's just set this to 120. As soon as I alter it, it comes up save, so I'm going to save that so it's locked in. Now it's jumped to the parameter view mode. Let's just look at the sequence. I've got the sequence set to a 2-bar loop, left and right 2 bars. So if I press play in Reason, the whole thing loops seamlessly, and I've got the same thing set up on the guitar sample. Come to the rack. Make sure they're both set the same. Yeah, that's fine. What I'm going to do now, I'm just going to turn the guitar track off so I'm only hearing the drums. Right, so in the drum sample, let's set the sample tempo to 60 and we'll leave the door at 120. Now you can see what's happened here. If I just zoom in a bit here, everything has been squashed into 1 bar. So when I press play, now this second bar of course in Reason is empty, so you can hear it's doubled the speed. So our next example, let's make a longer loop. Let's drag this out so it's 4 bars, like that. Okay, and bring this right locator out here. So I've now got a 4-bar loop. Let's set the sample BPM to 240, like that, and let's set the door BPM to 120, which it is. Press play. What's happening there is you can hear it's playing at slow speed, 60 BPM, but notice how the BPM of the sample is 240, and I explained all that earlier. So we've got a seamless 4-bar loop running at 60 BPM. Let's do another example here, and let's set the loop back to 2 bars, and we'll set the sample BPM to 240, which it is, and Reason's tempo to 120, which it is. Now let's see what happens now. And it's similar effect, but of course the sample gets jumping back to the beginning as the loop ends in reason. Let's do another example. Let's do a 4-bar loop again. Now let's do something weird here. Let's set the sample BPM to something weird like 230, and we'll leave reason at 120. Now let's put a click on so we can hear. You can hear what's happening. It's all out of sync, and the reason for that is this 230 in the BPM of the sample. So basically this has got to be a multiple of 120. It's either got to be 60 or 30 or 240, but as soon as I set it outside that, the whole thing goes out of sync. And of course this is only a problem if you're running the entire sample. If you're just taking slices and sequencing slices, bits of the sample, reordering it, this is not a problem. This is only if you're trying to trigger the entire sample or part of the sample like this. So let's set this BPM in the sample back to 240, and let's put the door BPM at 150. Now it doesn't matter what you set the reason BPM to, because as long as the sample BPM is the multiple of 120, like 30, 60, 120, 240. Now if I press play, what's happening here is that the sample is looping seamlessly for 4 bars, and it's 75 beats per minute. Because the sample BPM is set at 240 and reason's BPM is set at 150, the net result of that is 75, because this 240 in the sample BPM is halving reason's tempo. It's a bit of a brain burner, isn't it? It's all looping seamlessly. So to sum up, the sample BPM, this one here, has to be set to a multiple of 120, sort of 120, 60, 30, 240, 480 to sync with your DAW if you are triggering the whole sample from one note within reason. Right, so that was pretty crazy. I hope you found that interesting. It was very long-winded. I was trying not to be boring, but there is a lot to say about this. Like I say, I haven't gone through the entire machinations of Serato Sample, because there's lots of very obvious stuff there which I'm sure you know, and it has been dealt with elsewhere by Serato themselves or other people who have made videos. But I've dealt with some stuff there that totally blew my mind. I couldn't get my head around at all. If you did find this interesting, please give the video a like and consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks for watching, and you'll see me in my next video.